Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Conversation 4 this afternoon. And a very special welcome back to NGV members who are in the audience. My name's Ted Gott. I'm one of the people working in the curatorial team here at the NGV. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the NGV is built, and I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, it's a great pleasure to see you all here today at the opening of NGV Triennial, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest artists, Diane Al-Hadid, Heather B. Swan, and Richard Lua. Diane Al-Hadid's work delves into the mystical and scientific realms, incorporating sculpture, wall reliefs, and works on paper inspired by historical frameworks rooted in religious imagery, ancient manuscripts, female archetypes, and folklore storytelling. Heather B. Swan explores dark, sensual subjects using history, mythology, and natural sciences as sources for her figurative sculptures, including a human-headed Ouroboros, symbolizing wholeness, unity, and cycles. Richard Lua's biblical-themed paintings, particularly his depiction of the story of Adam and Eve, prompt contemplation of human nature's complexity and contradiction, addressing contemporary issues and societal decline and environmental crises without moral judgment. Would you please join me in welcoming our three artists? Now, if I could start with you, Dana. You've given your installation the overarching title of What Remains of the Floating Man Hypothesis. This is taken from the writings of the 2nd century Muslim philosopher Ibn Sina or Avicenna. Can you tell us something about this?
Yes. Okay.
Close.
So hi. Ooh, too loud. Somewhere along the line of developing this installation, I remembered Ibn Sina, as he's known in the Muslim world, Avicenna in the Western world, his floating man hypothesis, which is essentially asking us to imagine. So he was a philosopher and a physician, and he was posing this kind of thought experiment to try to prove the existence of the soul, and asked us to imagine essentially a person in a sensory deprivation chamber, what would be considered, so floating in the air, and determined that because the figure was self-aware and could think, that proved the existence of a soul. And it got me to thinking about, I guess as I'm getting older, I'm more and more interested in philosophy of mind and mind-body distinctions. And as I was looking at the Hans Memling painting, and this is one of the references that I used in one of the works, you see a mother holding up the weight of her son and struggling to hold up the weight of the body. So we're meant to understand that as the body having no soul, right? Removing the soul. So, to think about the soul as something that is up and elevated, and the body as something that's grounded and down, reminded me of another metaphorical concept that George Lakoff spoke of, called where the unknown is up and the known is down. So everything that we know is sort of on the ground. It's reflected in our language. We'll say, "What's up?" right? And that suggests that we don't know something. So all of these kind of metaphorical concepts that exist in our, that are encoded in our society and in our historical artifacts, kind of led me to call the work What Remains of the Floating Man Hypothesis.
Now, has this concept influenced your request for dramatic low lighting in your installation, giving everything a sense of floating through time and space?
Yeah, sure, it has. Again, to kind of keep, I don't know, the lighting thing is kind of new to me in the work. This is the first time that I've been so explicit with lighting my installations. And darkening the room as much and using black paint and black curtains. So yeah, I think I'm just not sure exactly how to respond to that yet, because it kind of feels very new, but you could
All right,
maybe
fair
tell
enough.
me.
Now, Richard, your Adam and Eve themed installation is also very dramatically spotlit in a blacked out gallery space. Was this a deliberate choice of yours as well?
Yeah, it was. I guess in a way, Amita, the curator, wanted to have a more of a sort of chapel idea, and with the idea of focusing these almost like a church setting. And I guess coming back to my upbringing, I was brought up a really strict Catholic, and seeing like the 14 stations, the 10 Commandments, the confessional box, they're all sort of visual memories I have of going to church. So I wanted to keep that idea alive in the gallery as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, Heather, your monumental sculpture, Ouroboros, is the contemporary interpretation of an ancient myth, the snake biting its own tail, which has signified ideas ranging from the cyclical nature of time to immortality and eternity across civilizations and millennia. Can you tell us what drew you to this subject?
I am drawn to things that we all recognize, that are ancient but also contemporary. I noticed that that particular symbol is everywhere in the contemporary world. Tattoos, necklaces, jewels, etc., etc. And what I like to do with my practice is to take things that we all recognize and we're familiar with and shift them a bit, or even stuff them up a bit, challenge them, make us have a little bit, or try to, not make, but I like myself to be a shapeshifter. That's how I feel, that's how I think of my practice. And I think of myself as an inventor, but I'm also driven by the surrealist idea of the uncanny, taking things that we know and putting things that we don't know together with things that we do know, so that you find yourself knowing something but being challenged at the same time. So the Ouroboros was a pretty obvious choice. It just kept popping up, so I decided to play with it. I also love to anthropomorphize objects, and I also have worked for a very long time, since my beginning of my practice 30 years ago, with the idea that we use animals as metaphors for our human behavior. And so it was a pretty obvious object that I would like to play with.
Thank you. Now, Diana, can you tell us about your background in Aleppo, Syria, and in Ohio in the US, and how this informs your worldview and art practice today?
In 1 minute?
In 1 minute.
Yeah, so I was born in Aleppo, Syria, and came to America when I was 5, and grew up in the suburbs of Ohio. So because I always joke that I, was born in the Middle East and then grew up in the Midwest, and I'm also a middle child, and everything in my life is sort of middled. And being an immigrant, you're kind of always in the middle of, this culture and the other culture. And so, your work is essentially an extension of your mind, right? It's inescapable. Even when you think that you've discovered some big new idea, for me, it feels like something I've been looking at, or that was core to my development or my identity since I was a kid. So yeah, I guess that's the best way that I can describe that my biography or my particular set of statistical anomalies coexist and are channeled through whatever I'm doing in my life, aka my work.
Okay. Now, Richard, in 2014 you had an artist residency with the Parangur community in the Pilbara in Western Australia. How did this impact your work, and can we see influence from this in your current triennial work?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Ted. I wish I kind of knew what you were going to ask before, when you said I should do that. But I guess in a way the best experiences I've had is going into communities. They have sort of enriched myself, my art practice, just me as an Australian. I'm born in New Zealand, but I have been living here for 25 years, and those are some of the most sort of pivotal times going into community, and just actually stopping and learning from the elders how they paint, how they collect their stories, how they live. I remember sort of one episode I was really hungry, and I didn't, there's no dairy to go eating at or anything like that to pick up food. And one of the small girls took me to the bush, and we had some hoo-hoo grubs. And I was thinking, if I was left out in the open, I would die. I have no knowledge of land. So experiences like that are just phenomenal. And I kind of recommend everyone should have that experience in Australia, especially with what just happened 2 months ago.
Well, that kind of relates to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Thanks, Ted.
Now, Heather, in 2018, you made a smaller version of Ouroboros, fashioned from stained wood, and in 2020, you created a somewhat smaller sculpture titled Feeler that resembled a monumental Bronze Age torque bracelet. How does your current Ouroboros relate to these earlier works?
The Ouroboros is simply a scaling up of the original Ouroboros sculptures. But the Ouroboros and the sculpture you're talking about called Peripherique, I think, which is a head with lots of legs sticking off it, is that right? And another sculpture I made called Bent Bone. They all come from that same place, trying to make something that's uncanny that we recognize, but we don't really quite understand. But formally, they were a part of my practice, which is quite minor, making spindly things, because I normally make quite big, heavy objects and big, heavy black shapes in my drawings. So occasionally it's nice to lighten up a little bit. Also, the bent bone, which is led into me making the Ouroboros, is really actually a bit of a sexy sculpture, and I do like to make things that make people think about sex, just because it's fun.
Fair enough. Diana, your Floating Man installation is based around two 15th century paintings from the Ingevis collection. Can you tell us about each of them and what drew you to them?
You said you were going to tell us about them.
Sorry.
So, I guess I'll keep it short. I mentioned earlier that one of them is a Hans Memling painting. It's called Man of Sorrows. I titled mine Mother of Sorrows. My painting removes the Jesus figure, and through that painting, which is really a wall work, it's less of a painting, more of a wall, or I don't know, architectural intervention, let's say. Through the work, you can see one of the Gothic sculptures from the collection of Jesus seated, but it really focuses on the feet and the groundedness. The lighting is kind of directs you to look down. Opposite that work and referencing a secular image is the painting The Garden of Love. And I guess I imagine this painting is kind of also strange and enigmatic and has a sort of a complicated provenance, and by the time that it arrived here, one of the figures had been removed. So there's two figures on one side of the painting, of the fountain, and three on the other. And so I wanted to, again, imagine what might be behind the painting, or what might be behind the story, or what we don't know of the story, and again, kind of made this kind of porous wall with more works from the collection behind the wall. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just to describe them a little bit, the Hans Memling was painted in 1475 in Bruges, in Flanders, in a very strict and closed Catholic community. The Garden of Love was painted by an unknown artist in Venice in 1460 to 75, and that's a secular work that celebrates Venice as the meeting place between East and West, as the great importation centre of the 15th century. Now, Richard, your work was described in today's Guardian newspaper as jewel-like. And yet, while teeming with colours that one could describe as joyous, there seems to be a darker edge to the narratives you've brought to this year's Triennial. I'm tempted to use the word apocalyptic.
Yeah, I guess I started making it during COVID, so I kind of had the end of the world in sight, and I guess in a way that's kind of why I started making it. I was kind of, well, it was the end of the world for a lot of us. We didn't know what was going to happen, so I kind of thought backwards and thought, how did we start? Is this going to be the end? So I wanted to sort of document that. So in a way, yeah, it is apocalyptic, but it's also, it's interesting that they said it's jewel-like, and I guess it's could be something to do with the paintings are kind of made with stains. Sort of I have little control over that. They're painted on the back of the canvas, so not primed. And in a way, I just let the colours evolve and stain-like emerge and have their own sort of direction, which was a new sort of way to paint for me. It's like Heather was saying, I like to be a bit of a shapeshifter myself in painting, and I think that makes it really exciting when you don't know what your end painting's going to be.
Great, thank you. Now, Heather, you've said elsewhere that you were fascinated by the Japanese concept of the pathos of things, the deep sadness or melancholy which is at the heart of some objects. Would it be fair to read an element of this into your Ouroboros? And you had an arts residency in Japan in 2017. Can you reflect upon how that changed your approach to both art and life?
Okay. I think possibly that Ouroboros does not fit into the mono aware. That's the concept which I think that's how you say it in Japanese, which is roughly translated as the pathos or the sadness or the deep feeling of objects. Yeah. And the Ouroboros, it doesn't really sit that comfortably with that particular concept, although I guess our existence, our place here on earth, our ephemerality, the fact that we live, we die, and then someone else lives and dies, and it continues on, does fit in there. The residency in Japan was quite life-changing because it is a very different world. I'd never been to Japan before 2017, and I found myself looking and listening to the shape and the sounds and the actions of the people performing everyday actions. I've always been interested in the everyday, but particularly in Japan, there are so many people folding linen and hanging things and perfectly shaping trees, and there are people doing those very ordinary actions for hours, and you can walk in the street and see those actions being performed because it is such a crowded place and everybody is just performing these actions out in the street or in the cemetery. And so I came away from that residency determined to make an exhibition about our everyday lives. I actually called the exhibition I Let My Body Fall Into a Rhythm, which is the place that we're always trying to get to, I think, whether it be through exercise or gardening or making art or making music or sex or drinking or whatever it is. So, and for that exhibition, I Let My Body Fall Into a Rhythm, I started with the sound of a stone carver that I heard at the cemetery. And I was just walking along the road, and the cemetery's right there near the main road, and I heard the stone carver, and it was such a beautiful sound. And it was about this melancholy in the object, in the stone carving in the cemetery. And the man that I could see in a beautiful uniform stopped carving, but I could still hear the stone carving, and that's because obviously there must have been another stone carver inside the tomb. And so he continued with the noise, and that was when I came up with this concept of letting my body fall into a rhythm and making an exhibition from that. And so I made 8 different sculptures which were used as performance tools, but they also existed as sculptures that could just be hanging in space or sitting on the floor. And I'll just tell you about one of them really quickly. One of them, I decided I wanted to make a sculpture that represented how artists work. And so I couldn't get there, I just couldn't get there. And eventually I realized that how artists work is 24/7. And what artists do is, as we are walking through the world, or sleeping, or having sex, or eating, or performing any action, it is as if the world is giving us a butterfly kiss the whole time. So it could be your beautiful blue color. It's just touching us. And sometimes we're not even really conscious of those things that are coming at us the whole time. Artists, musicians, writers, the people who are producing this stuff from nothing. And so I decided to make the eyelashes that were butterfly, because a butterfly kiss is this phenomenon when somebody stands next to you and flutters their eyelashes against your cheek. So I made a sculpture with many of these eyelashes, and then it was performed with by the 7 different performers in Japan. And it was the most popular of the sculptures, because I just gave open slather to the performers. I said, you can play with any of the sculptures you like for as long as you like. And what they all wanted to do was to walk around with these eyelashes fluttering around them. It's very beautiful.
Now, Diana, the beautiful concrete yet transparent walls that frame your installations here at the NGV seem to drip downwards with glistening splendour, almost like stalactites in a cave. Can you tell us how you actually make these fascinatingly solid yet seemingly liquid structures?
I can't give you all my secrets. Well, I guess, it begins with gravity and my love-hate relationship with gravity. These materials came from my sculptural practice, so they're, even though they're inspired by flat paintings, pictorial works, the materials are kind of common day sculptural materials, plasters, gypsum, steel, fiberglass, contemporary materials, old and new. I guess the reason that they drip is because I work quickly with wet material, and I work in many multiple layers. And it's sort of built up, one kind of color at a time, and then reinforced so that in the end, the more transparent portions of the work are areas that I hadn't painted. So it's kind of opposite of what I think a lot of people imagine taking place, that it's not actually a removal, but it's an additive process.
All right, thank you. Now, Richard, in the past, you've reflected upon the intersection of religion and crime in your works. For example, in 2013, you made a series of paintings addressing the 10 Commandments that were based upon images of these that you found in the prison chapel in West Australia's Fremantle Prison. Is there a sense in which your current Adam and Eve works treat this creation story as a crime scene?
Interesting. I mean, it definitely can be a crime, the whole, the Adam and Eve story. I like sort of the connection between religion, crime, and sport. I've sort of did a boxing performance many years ago now where I challenged an artist to a boxing match, and immediately I saw the parallels between being an artist and being a boxer, and that's kind of carried on with me the whole time. So I do think there's lots of parallels between crime and religion as well. I think, like the 10 Commandments, all these rules. So you weren't allowed to eat the poison fruit. It's something like that. And I kind of then look at the virus, as people were told to get injections, we rebelled against that. There's all these sort of connections and patterns within religion and crime.
Thank you.
Cool.
Now, Heather, can you tell us about the great classical scholar Roberto Calasso and how his writings have influenced your approach to interpreting ancient mythologies?
Well, Roberto Calasso, my favorite writer, he died last year. He died last year. Or at the end, yeah, last year. And he wrote 11 books, which were designed to be a history of the world. And the first book that I read by him was called The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, which was a retelling of ancient Greek mythology, the Golden Age. And he wrote it in the style of Ovid, where you tell the stories of each of the myths over and over again in different ways. It's very hard to read, but it's absolutely worthwhile. I had 3 copies of that book, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, for 22 years, and I read it regularly, but I never read it from the beginning to the end. So when I was invited to make an exhibition about the ancient Greek myth of Lethe and the swan, I read the book from the beginning to the end and found the most amazing hypothesis, which is about myth being like a wave upon the shore, that it's the same, but it's always different. And that informed my reading of the myth of Lethe and the swan. And it also has informed my practice, and I now understand that myth comes from the stories that we tell each other in order to protect each other. And it's the stories that we keep telling that become myth. And all of those stories, including the myth that you're playing with and the stories that you're playing with, they're all challengeable, and they all often involve crime and to various degrees. And it's incredibly rich territory for artists. And Roberto Colasso sums them all up. He sums them all up. So he's written that book about ancient Greek mythology, but then he's also written a book about Baudelaire, in which he goes into the early 20th century and poetry, and he explains concepts like the correspondences, in which he explains that the correspondences, which is a term I think invented or coined by Baudelaire. Do you know, Ted? No. But it means that everything we do and everything we see has a metaphor.
It's like
Everything.
synesthesia.
Yes, that's correct, yeah. So there's nothing that happens that doesn't have a double meaning. I mean, and that it's just so rich, such a rich idea. And I mean, that's a very simple summation of this whole book about Baudelaire. But he's a man of ideas, and I'm never going to stop reading him.
Cool. Heather, your work has often reflected your interest in the myths and artifacts. Sorry, Diana. Forgive me. Dana, you were invited to, your work frequently explores religious themes drawn from multiple cultures, yet you describe yourself as an atheist. Oh. Is there a contradiction here, or are the two linked?
I don't, Okay, we're getting deep.
I'm also an atheist, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Just to make you feel more comfortable.
I guess if I have to put words to it, I think what I would describe, and this is just between us, right? What I would describe my beliefs as respecting so many different cultures and curious in the ways in which we have come together and also sorted ourselves apart throughout time. And I approach it with an intellectual curiosity. A lot of, religions. I don't think that religion equals all, spirituality. I think I find a lot of spirituality in work, in art, I guess for me, it's just that I don't adhere to any, closed set of ideas. I think it's impossible to know what happens after death. And that's all I can say. It's that there's no way to prove the existence. Everyone will debate it to the end of time. But I'm exhausted by the effort to prove it. I'm more interested in witnessing that as a human kind of as a collective, sociological obsession.
Right, thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no worries.
Now I'll put Richard on the spot. Now, Richard, I don't want to call you a conspiracy theorist, but I do know that you've been fascinated by the Westall High School cover-up. Since this occurred in Melbourne in 1966, in Clayton, in the eastern suburbs, and I grew up in Forest Hill myself, I've also been intrigued by this as well. So why am I raising this? Well, I'm wondering, first of all, you could tell us about the Westall incident, and whether you've had any thoughts about the impact that confirmation of the existence of alien life might have upon religious belief in today's world, given your Adam and Eve cycle.
I'll just carry on, Diane, for a second. I'll go back to that. I feel like as an artist, sometimes, it's the most scariest thing to talk about religion. Like, I can paint anything, and people are like, oh, yeah, that's great, that's fantastic. As soon as it's a religious narrative, or, it's got that religious overtone, people don't really want to know too much about it, and they're very happy to walk away from it. So I find it's a fascinating place to be. I'm not an atheist, I believe. I've been, like I said, been brought up as strict Catholic, and I think I use the art and the way of telling stories to understand my own faith and belief system. So I think it's kind of important to tell, because that's what the Adam and Eve story is about also. But getting back to the Westall, it's a fascinating story. It's like, it happened at a high school, Westall High School. What year, Ted? What year?
1966.
66, where over 300 students witnessed a UFO landing in the school backyard. Yeah, I know. And probably
Yes.
not many people have heard of it. And there was a massive cover-up as soon as all the teachers came out and the students were like, what is that? They were ushered into the schoolrooms, and all these black cars turned up, and they were told, no, you didn't see a thing, nothing happened here. So it was a massive cover-up, and when you start reading into it, you go, oh my God, this is insane. And like, I totally believe it. I sort of made a couple of paintings about it, and
Yes.
visited the school sites and everything, and it still remains an ongoing mystery now today.
In former times, it would have been called a miracle, of course.
Absolutely.
Now it's just called a form of mass hysteria. So, look, I've just got time for one more question for Heather. Heather, you describe yourself as a museum junkie. Can you tell us what that means to you?
Museum junkie, that means that I go on a holiday and I never ever wear a sarong and sit on the beach, which I've been longing to all my life. We always go to the museum and the gallery and we look at art until we drop. I didn't actually travel outside of Australia until I was 36, and I had a 5-month residency in Paris, which is very exciting and also nerve-wracking. I couldn't speak French very well, and I spent every single day at the crack. As soon as the museums and galleries open, I would be in there, and I would not leave until the end of the day. And in fact, in 2019, I went to Athens on a residency to look at the ancient Greek sculpture and study the tradition. And I went to the Acropolis Museum one day, and it was amazingly beautiful museum. And I went at the beginning, and then at the very end of the day, I staggered out of the museum, and the staff applauded me and said, brava, because I'd spent the entire day there watching all of the bus tours go through in an hour, and I just draw objects, and that's just part of the accumulation of our knowledge base. Yeah, that's the same as having the world touch you like a kiss all of the time, just looking at objects. I am convinced of the magic of objects and the pathos of objects, and I am amazed at our human invention. Aren't we amazing? All of the objects and beautiful machines and decorations and religious objects that we have made and we still hang on to and we still think about. It's where art comes from.
Thank you, and please promise us, Heather, that one day you'll stage an exhibition of your sketchbooks. That would be fantastic. Now, would you please thank our 3 terrific artists, Diane Al-Hadid, Heather B. Swan, and Richard Lua. And if you haven't already seen their works, please make your way upstairs after this and have a look at them. But you may wish also to stay for the next interview session, which starts at 3 p.m. Could you also give a round of applause to our fantastic Auslan interpreters? Thank you.
And to you.